Good morning. My name is Charlie Baum, and we're going to look at a sample problem in our topic on comparative advantage. In this chart, we're assuming that there are two different countries, Spain and Portugal, and each of the countries has the ability to produce ships or wine. The wine is measured in tons. The chart below shows on each row the maximum quantity of ships and wine that each country can produce. For example, Spain has the opportunity to produce 40 ships, but if it makes ships, it has no resources left with which to make wine. On the other hand, Spain could make 60 ships, but this would leave no resources in Spain with which to make wine. And there are also output levels in between that are possible that involve producing both wine and ships. For example, if Spain produces 20 ships, then it has the ability to produce 30 tons of wine. At the same time, this chart shows us Portugal's output production possibilities frontier. Portugal has the ability to make 60 ships, but if it makes 60 ships, it has no resources left with which to make wine. On the other hand, Portugal could produce 40 tons of wine, but if it does, it has no resources left with which to make ships. And points in between are possible as well. Here's how you would interpret this table. Producing 15 ships and 30 tons of wine is also a possibility for Portugal. On this slide, we're looking again at the chart that shows us Spain and Portugal's production possibilities frontier. First, I want to examine which country has a comparative advantage producing ships. The country that has a comparative advantage producing something is the one that can produce it at lower opportunity cost. So let's calculate the opportunity cost of producing ships for each country. If Spain produces 30 ships and goes from 0 to 10, then that means it's going to have to give up producing 15 tons of wine. And this is a consistent opportunity cost throughout the table for Spain. For example, if Spain raises their production of ships from 10 to 20, then they'll have to reduce their production of wine by 15. So for every 10 ships Spain produces, it will have to reduce its production of wine by 15. So the opportunity cost of 10 ships for Spain is 15 tons of wine. The opportunity cost of one ship for Spain is 1.5 tons of wine. Now let's look at the opportunity cost of producing a ship for Portugal. If Portugal produces 15 ships, it will have to give up 10 tons of wine. If Portugal goes from 15 ships to 30 ships, then it will have to give up, again, 10 tons of wine. So for every 15 ships that Portugal produces, it will have to give up 10 tons of wine. For every one ship that Portugal produces, it will have to give up 2/3 of a ton of wine. Since an opportunity cost of a ship being equal to 2/3 of a ton of wine is a lower cost than an opportunity cost of 1.5 tons of wine, this means that Portugal has the comparative advantage producing ships. Portugal can produce the ships at lower opportunity cost. Portugal can produce ships at lower cost in terms of wine. Next, let's look at which country has a comparative advantage for producing wine. Okay, if Spain goes from producing 0 to 15 tons of wine, then it will have to give up 10 ships. If Portugal goes from producing 0 to 10 tons of wine, it will have to give up 15 ships. So the opportunity cost of producing wine is lower for Spain. For every 15 tons of wine that Spain produces, it gives up 10 ships. This means the opportunity cost of one of those tons of wine is 2/3 of a ship for Spain. So Spain's opportunity cost is only 2/3 of a ship for each ton of wine. But for every 10 tons of wine that Portugal produces, it has to give up 15 ships. And so the opportunity cost of one of these tons of wine for Portugal is 1.5 ships. So the opportunity cost for Portugal is 1.5 ships. The opportunity cost for Spain is 2/3 of a ship. And since that cost is lower for Spain, Spain has a comparative advantage in producing wine because its cost in terms of ships is lower for Spain. This is going to suggest for us in just a moment that with specialization, Spain should be the one producing the wine because it can do it at lower opportunity cost, and Portugal should be the one producing the ships because they can produce ships at lower opportunity cost. So let's have each country specialize in doing more of what it's best at. Let's have each country produce only that good for which it has a comparative advantage. That means Spain is only going to produce wine. Portugal is only going to produce ships. In particular, Portugal will produce 60 ships and Spain will produce 60 tons of wine. And then we'll have trade and we'll see whether the countries are better off with specialization and trade. But I need something to compare that to. Let's compare that to production and consumption before trade. For example, let's suppose that before trade, Spain is producing 20 ships and 30 tons of wine. That's on this row of the table. And let's suppose that Portugal, before trade, is producing 30 ships and 20 tons of wine. If that's what they're producing before trade and there's no trade, then that's also what they're going to be consuming. So when you combine these two countries, they're going to be able to consume 50 ships, 20 from Spain, 30 from Portugal, and 50 tons of wine, 30 from Spain and 20 from Portugal. So without specialization, without trade, 50 tons of wine and 50 ships are produced. But with specialization, Spain is able to make 60 tons of wine, and Portugal is able to make 60 ships. That's 10 more tons of wine than before without trade. That's 10 more ships than before without trade. Without trade, the two countries combined were making 50 ships and 50 tons of wine. With specialization, Spain produces 60 tons of wine, Portugal produces 60 ships, and so that's 10 more ships than before. That's 10 more tons of wine than before. This shows us that with specialization, based on comparative advantage, the two countries combined are able to increase output. So let's suppose that the two countries are producing 60 tons of wine and 60 ships. If they engage in trade, then they both can be made better off. Let's graph the production possibilities frontier for Spain and the consumption possibilities frontier for Spain. You may recall from the prior slide that if Spain does not trade, then they have the ability to produce a maximum of 40 ships, that's that point, or a maximum of 60 tons of wine. But with production based on specialization and trade, Spain is able to produce 60 ships and then trade those ships, 60 tons of wine, and then trade that wine to Portugal for ships in order to be made better off. Let's suppose that the terms of trade are 1 ship for 1 ton of wine. This means that if Spain specializes in producing 60 tons of wine, then they could trade that on a 1-to-1 basis for up to 60 ships. So the dotted green line in this diagram shows us Spain's consumption possibilities frontier. The solid green line shows us their production possibilities frontier. And since the consumption possibilities frontier is outside of the production possibilities frontier, this shows us that with specialization based on comparative advantage and trade, Spain can be made better off. Spain is able to consume more stuff, more wine and more ships, with trade from Portugal. We could draw one of these diagrams for Portugal as well, and that would show us that Portugal simultaneously is made better off with specialization and trade.